You're listening to episode 329 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Seth Zuiho Segall joins us to speak about Buddhism and human flourishing, a modern Western perspective. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circles and book club, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. As Buddhism has encountered different cultures through the ages, it has contributed new ways of thinking and being, and itself has been influenced by the people who resonate with it. Perhaps most extraordinary is the ways in which the sasana is touching and being touched by modernity, science, and an increasingly global community. What is meant by enlightenment to a Western Buddhist may be very different from the deep spirituality of heritage Buddhism. So how do we start to understand this vast and ever-changing territory? Seth Zuiho Segall is a Zen Buddhist priest and psychologist who taught at 4 universities and directed the psychology department of a large urban northeastern hospital. He's the author of Buddhism and Human Flourishing, a Modern Western Perspective, and the author-editor of Encountering Buddhism, Western Psychology and Buddhist Teachings. His book, Living Zen, Practical Guide of Balanced Existence, will be published in 2020. He writes about Buddhist philosophy, psychology, ethics, art, history, social engagement, and practice for his blog, The Existential Buddhist, and is the science writer for the Mindfulness Research Monthly. So sit back, relax, and have a nice sleepy time tea. Our guest today is Seth Zuiho Segall. Seth, welcome to the podcast. It's so nice to see you again.
It's good to see you, Ted, again, too.
So for folks who are listening to this episode, Seth and I have known each other for quite some time. And the last time I think we've seen each other in person was at one of the scientific conferences at the Center for Mindfulness. So
we're at the Center for Mindfulness.
Yeah, so it's been a while, and you have a new book coming out, and that's what we're going to be diving in today. But before we go into that, I'd like you to just tell us about your background.
All right. Well, I can tell you my background along 2 different tracks. There's a Buddhist background and a psychology background. So my Buddhist background begins over 55 years ago, when a fellow by the name of Alan Watts came to my college and gave a series of lectures that I attended. And I was off and running from that point on. I was fascinated. I read everything that existed in the early 1960s about Buddhism in English, which wasn't very much at that time. Read all the D.T. Suzuki books, and Philip Kapleau's book came about a little bit later, and so forth, Paul Reps. So it was something I maintained an interest in for a number of years and really pursued, but there was really no place for me to go with it. There were no teachers nearby. And I really couldn't get involved in practice. It was just an intellectual understanding of what I could understand at that time, of Buddhism. But my actual involvement in practice began from being a clinical psychologist and working with a large number of patients with chronic pain. And I had been treating them with the methods that I had learned using biofeedback or hypnosis. And I wasn't particularly thrilled with the results I was getting.
Mhm.
And around that time, Jon Kabat-Zinn was on a television program that Bill Moyers had set up called The Healing of the Mind. And I watched him teaching chronic pain patients how to meditate. And as I watched him, it felt like all my old interest in Buddhism got reawakened at that point in time. And one of Jon Kabat-Zinn's teachers, a teacher by the name of Ferris Urbanowski, came to my state to give a one-day workshop. And I sat with her and meditated for about 8 hours with her in what was like a kind of the standard MBSR retreat kind of format. And I realized that I just absolutely loved the practice. I fell in love with it at that instant. And I said, I want to do this every day for the rest of my life in some way. So I asked Ferris, gee, I'd love to do an internship, up at the Center for Mindfulness at UMass. And she said, well, you can't just do that. You have to have had at least a year's of, worth of your own practice. And you have to have been at least one 10-day Buddhist meditation retreat. So, okay, I got started that way. Did a bunch of retreats up at IMS and sat for myself for about a year or so. And then I went ahead and did an internship over at the Center for Mindfulness with Ferris. And that was the beginning. That was about 25 years ago or so. And then the interest has just continued. I mean, there's not much more to say about that. And then I always had the fantasy of ordaining at some point along the line, but I started in the Theravada tradition, and you can't be married in order to be ordained in that tradition. But about a dozen years ago or so, I moved up to New York State, and there wasn't any insight meditation community in my neighborhood to belong to. So I joined a Zen community. And I found out that in the Japanese tradition, priests can marry. So that was my path forward for ordination. And I wanted to ordain for a whole bunch of reasons. I thought that the Buddhist convert community in the United States was large enough that there might be a need for people who can perform marriages or funerals and so forth, rites of passage. And I wanted to do some interfaith work with some of the priests and rabbis in my community on a kind of equal footing. And then I was interested in chaplaincy work. So for the last 4 years, I've been a chaplain associate at a local hospital. So it's led me in all kinds of interesting directions.
Yeah. And what I really like about this, and what makes you particularly qualified to speak about what we'll be talking about today, is that you do inhabit a couple of different worlds. That it's not just a view of someone in one particular context, but you have a great deal of experience and time in several different areas. And so some of the tensions we're going to be talking about are something you've been inhabiting that space for a long time. And thank you for that background. I really appreciate it. And I'm curious then, what led you to write this particular book?
Well, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and it has to do with my continual awareness of a discrepancy between what I experience in my own practice when I sit down to meditate, what I get out of it, how I can understand my own experiences meditating, and what I hear from the tradition. I started practice with a very, very open mind. So if a Buddhist teacher said, well, reincarnation is real, or there is such thing as a state of perfect enlightenment that we ought to pursue, and on and on and on, all these different beliefs, I would say, okay, who knows? It's not my first choice for what I would believe as a kind of a scientifically trained person, but it could be true. Science could be wrong. So let's just sit with it, and maybe you'll discover it's true over time.
Science is tentative. It's not a foregone conclusion, and that's the experimentation. Where can we learn more?
Exactly. And then I found myself listening, as I've listened to thousands of Dharma talks over the years by teachers in all the traditions, Vajrayana, Theravada, Zen, Asian and North American teachers and so forth.
Mhm.
I found that most of the time I listen to Dharma talks, I find myself disagreeing with a fair amount of what I'm hearing that doesn't comport with my own experience.
As many listeners to the Secular Buddhist podcast may resonate with that experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been trying to navigate where do those differences lie between my own understanding experience and what the tradition says. And then it takes maybe about 25 years to get up the courage to finally say it out loud and write in the book, knowing that you might not please everybody in what you have to say. So I think I could have written this book maybe 10 years ago, but it took a while. It took reaching a certain age where I no longer care what people think so much to be able to go ahead and actually write it.
It's so interesting to hear about that experience because my own engagement has been very similar to yours in a few different traditions. I started in Zen and then into Theravada and did also consider ordination and found it just wasn't quite right for me. It's not that it's a wrong thing at all, it just wasn't quite a fit for me in my life. And also finding that cognitive dissonance with some of what I was hearing, what I was experiencing in my own practice, and questioning, is this me? Am I doing it wrong, quotey fingers? Or is there just something that isn't quite the right fit here? Is it maybe that? And unlike you, I didn't wait. I spoke up right away, which has had me labeled as a heretic for quite a long time now. And that's really, I think, a bit of a disservice to, well, can we genuinely question? Isn't there space for that kind of exploration where we don't have a foregone conclusion? It only can be this one thing. How can we know that? So thank you for that. And let's talk about the premise of the book, because it really gets at the heart of what we're talking about, one of the core tensions that exist. Tell us about the premise to the book.
Well, the premise of the book is that as we in the West inherit a tradition that comes to us originating some 2,500 years ago from a different culture, how do we understand and make use of that within our own culture? Because when you borrow ideas from another culture, we can only understand it from the memes and ideas that already exist that we've already absorbed in our own culture. And having been enculturated and grown up here, there are certain things that are just so inherent in the way we look at the world, in what we intuit about it, how we experience it, that there's no way that we cannot interpret those things we're inheriting within that context and changing it or misunderstanding it in certain ways, or making use of it in the only way that we can. And the danger lies in when we pretend to believe things we don't really believe, or we try to hold two ideas in our minds at the same time that are incompatible. And so I'm interested in, as Westerners, as modern Westerners, inherit these ideas, how can we change them in the way that makes sense to us as Westerners, and really something we can believe in fully and entirely, deep in our bones, without any inner contradiction. And also, I've been observing that people have been making these changes all along in the culture. If you look at what contemporary Western teachers, Zen teachers and insight meditation teachers, and even Tibetan teachers say, they're actually saying something a little bit different from what the tradition has historically said. Sometimes it isn't openly acknowledged, sometimes it's covert. But the kind of changes that I feel I need to make to understand it as a Westerner, and the kinds of changes I observe them making as they try to teach to Westerners, they all fit a certain pattern or occur in a certain pattern. I'm trying to understand, what is that pattern? And is there a way that we can tie this all together in a coherent way that makes sense? So that was the intention of the book. Okay, so the original tension is between the aim of practice in traditional Buddhism, which is at the aim of something that we call awakening or enlightenment, some kind of attainment of that sort, and what we in the West understand as genuine well-being. And that's something that derives from the ancient Greek tradition. And I take Aristotle as an exemplar of that, with his idea of eudaimonia, or exceptional well-being, which means his idea of well-being includes both a life that's happy, but also a life that's in some objectively way good. Okay, because we could be happy and our lives could still be very poor lives that we don't want to give any approval to. You can think about a psychopath, for example, who might be happy, but we don't think his life is a good one, or someone in the grips of a mania who has extraordinary happiness, but is leading a life that's spiraling down into ruin. We don't want to go that way. So we have a certain intuition about what it means to live a good life, what it means to be happy, what it means to be an admirable human being. And those clash, I think, in very profound ways with what the Buddhist tradition says the aim of practice ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I could talk about that for a little bit if you'd like.
Yes, please. Actually, I'd like to get into that. Maybe
So,
one thing we can get into in a moment is first
mm-hmm.
I want to ask about, before you dive into that,
Mm-hmm.
is one of the other things that comes up for us in secular Buddhism in particular is we're really trying very hard to avoid any kind of cultural appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
I do acknowledge that I am not Japanese or Sri Lankan or any Asian heritage is simply not part of what I'm doing. My cultural context is different. And yet there's tremendous value and beauty and transformative power in various traditions within Buddhism, whether it be Zen or Theravada or Vajrayana or whatever someone is encountering. So I'm also interested in hearing from you at some point during a conversation about that concept of cultural appropriation. How do we as Westerners engage with a practice that is something that might not be part of our own heritage?
Well, let me tell you a little story about that. There's a song that the blues singer Leadbelly sang called Stew Ball. You might have heard it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a British skiffle singer in the 1960s by the name of Lonnie Donegan. And he sang a version of that in the 1960s in England as a kind of a British skiffle music hall kind of song. And it's not a very good version of it. But critics lambasted him terribly for how can someone from the British Isles sing this song that comes from the authentic, blues roots. He's like culturally appropriating the blues, and it's a terrible thing. But then if you look into the provenance of the song Stew Ball, where did it come from? Where did Leadbelly learn it? Well, he learned it from prisoners in Angola prison, which was an all-black prison down in the south, where he had been in prison for a while. And then you go back a little bit further, where did the prisoners learn it from? Well, it had been a popular Broadway tune before they picked it up. And where did Broadway pick it up from? Well, Stew Ball was an Irish racehorse, and it was originally a British Isles song. It's amazing the way that things get traded back and forth, and we think they belong to one culture, and then we find out that there really isn't that kind of provenance of things. They don't belong to just one culture exclusively. And while I think there are many ways that white Western Buddhists and European Buddhists have demeaned Asian Buddhism by looking at it through the lens of Protestantism, for example, or looking at it from the point of view of the superiority of Western rationality and science, and saying, well, this is superstitious, or this is that, the other thing, or the practice they're engaging in isn't the real Buddhism. The real Buddhism is found in the sutras and not in what the average person in the street does. And so there are dangers that need to be avoided. I don't think there's anything wrong with picking it up and making it our own practice and adopting it to our own needs, any more than I think there's anything wrong with eating a taco or pizza, or Chinese food. We can enjoy all those things without having to be ashamed of ourselves.
Seth, appreciate that. So let's talk about the premise and the tension and unpacking that a bit.
Okay, so let's look at the ideal of enlightenment and what I think is wrong with it for us. I'm not saying it's wrong for everybody. I'm saying it's wrong for us as modern Westerners and converts. First, there are a couple of things wrong with it. First is the idea that this is some kind of final perfected state. And what might be the contents of that perfected state? Well, it means that someone who is enlightened would be always mindful. They'd be always compassionate. They'd be freed of attachment and desire. And we can go down a long list of things that they might be. And the first thing I'll note is that although I've met a great many teachers in all the traditions over the years, and have been in the presence of some of the best, and have admired many of them for their characteristics, I've never met anyone who met the state of perfection in any of those. Okay. All of them have the capacity to become irritated. All of them have the capacity to have a desire for something at one time or another. All of them might be attached to something. They're never perfectly mindful, only maybe a little bit more so, and so forth. So if you're looking for a model of perfection that no one you have ever met and no one you are ever likely to have met ever reaches, why would you want to put a lot of energy into trying to attain that? Because the odds of you attaining it, even if it existed sometime historically, would be exceedingly small. Okay? So I think it's okay to try to be more compassionate and more mindful and more discerning and so forth, and not think that there's some perfect place over there that you can be. So I want to change the idea of enlightenment from something that you can achieve to just a horizon out there you can navigate towards in the general direction. But then I want to look at the specifics of it, and I want to say, do we really want to go there in the first place? Do I really want to be desireless? Do I really want to have no attachments? To me, that kind of orientation makes no sense at all. If I have no desires to be a better father, to be a better spouse, to be a more humane person, to be more mindful, go down the list, be more discerning, be wiser. If I have no desires to do that, why bother at all, right? If you don't have any desire to, if you never got thirsty and never got hungry and never got lonely and on and on and on, why bother getting out of bed in the morning? Why would any artist produce a work of art if they didn't want to create beauty? And why would any scientist discover a cure for a disease if they didn't want to advance human well-being? These are all desire-based activities. And the idea that we want to get rid of all of them makes no sense. And the same thing with attachment. It's our attachments to the people we love that make our life really worth living. Do I really want to not have a special attachment to my children, or a special attachment to my sister or to my wife? I can't imagine that leading to a better life in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, the challenge I've had is along these lines where a classically described enlightenment has one not suffering when one's child passes away, for example, one of the deepest hurts we can have. And to me, and again, as you had said earlier, this is for us in our cultural context. It doesn't mean that this is not appropriate for others and theirs. This is a practice of severing me from my humanity.
Exactly. The issue is, do we want to become the best human beings we can be, or do we want to become transhuman in some kind of way? The Western philosopher Bernard Williams gives us a scenario where you're at the beach and two people are drowning, and one is your beloved wife and the other is a complete stranger, and conditions are such you can only save one. And he says, should you go through this kind of moral crisis deciding who you ought to save, should you just have benevolent compassion for everyone and be random who you pick, or do you have a right to have a preference to save your life in that condition? And he said, thinking that way is one thought too much. And I've always loved that answer because of the way in which, if you don't have that kind of preference for your family, for example, it means you've kind of transcended humanity. You're no longer, what would you think of a human being who felt that way, who didn't care any more for his own children than somebody else's children? I think there's something of value in the Buddhist tradition when it says, try as best as you can to adopt a benevolent attitude towards everyone, no matter who they are. That's great. But to say that you should have no preference whatsoever, that your equanimity should be so complete that you have no special preference for your own, I don't think that's human. I don't think it's humanly possible, and I don't think it's humanly good, even more important.
Right.
I wouldn't want to live in a world where people didn't have those kind of preferences.
And how about human flourishing? Talk a bit about what's meant by that as perhaps a counter to this classically articulated enlightenment.
Yeah, so the idea of human flourishing, or eudaimonia as it is in Greek, was devised by Aristotle. And first of all, I want to just say something about Aristotle. He's like maybe the most amazing mind that ever lived. He was wrong about a lot of things, fundamentally wrong about a lot of things, but who isn't, right? You think that even the smartest person is probably wrong about 50% of the time, but he was astoundingly wrong about women and about slaves and about barbarians. He has terrible views on those sorts of things. He probably has a very bad metaphysics in terms of his understanding of essences, at least the way we understand them today. But when he writes about, but on the other hand, he knew more than anyone else in his time. He wrote about biology, he wrote about poetics, he wrote about ethics, he wrote about politics, he wrote about logic, and on and on and on. I mean, there isn't a single topic that he didn't have something intelligent and important to say. So he was looking around roughly within about 100 years or so of the Buddha, and asking, what do we mean by a good life? What's meant by possessing well-being? And he was an empiricist rather than an ideologue. He said, well, let's go around and see what everybody else thinks. And let's see if there's a way we can understand what everyone thinks. And by everyone, he meant the Greek nobility at the time, the aristocracy. But he said, let's go around and see what people think. And he came up with a kind of a three-part view of what well-being was. He says, the first thing is, well-being is achieving excellence in the things that really matter to us as human beings. And he has a list of things that are excellences or virtues that include things like honesty or courage or not being too stingy and friendliness and so forth. He has a long list of things that he thinks we ought to develop them, and they are developable. You develop them by practicing. So the other thing he says is you need to develop intellectual virtues as well. And one of his virtues is what he calls practical judgment, or phronesis. And practical judgment means the ability to know at any given situation what the right thing to do is, how much of the right thing to do, when is the right time to do it, who is the right person to do it with, and so on. It's a whole practical sense of negotiating the world that leads you to good outcomes. Because you don't want to just be courageous under all conditions, or honest under all conditions, because some of that will lead you into stupidity. When the Nazis, Gestapo comes to your door and says, are you hiding Jews? You don't want to be honest and say yes. Okay, that's honesty, but it's not practical wisdom. So he says we want to develop these virtues, and so behaving virtuously or living a life that's virtuous is one important part of well-being, but it's not all of it. He says the other thing is you need to be able to you need to have not only practical wisdom, but philosophical wisdom. He says trying to understand what things are all about, trying to get to things at their deepest, contemplating the nature of the world. He says the ability to kind of add an element of contemplation in our life and contemplate those things that are deepest, this is not even a word, is it? The things that are of deepest importance to us, and understanding what they really are and truly are. And he has his own list of what those things might be, and it's different from our list. But he says that contemplation of reality and nature and truth is another important part. And the third important part, he says, is working in our communities to create this kind of society where everyone is capable of achieving virtue and contemplation and wisdom. So you want to arrange the laws and customs and mores of society so that everyone is capable of the highest level of well-being they're capable of. And in book 10 of his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, he kind of contradicts this a little bit and says, no, forget all what I said. Contemplation is the highest good. He sounds a little Buddhist in that way. But in all the other 9 books, he says, no, being socially engaged, being virtuous, and having an understanding of wisdom are the most important things. And those are the things that will make you not perfectly happy all the time, but as happy as you can be under most circumstances, and as admirable as you can be under most circumstances. And that when you're on your deathbed, look back, you can say, that was a good life. And not to be too ideological about things or too dogmatic. He says, well, you need some other things too. He says, it helps to have a few material goods and not to be too sick. He says, because nobody who's dying of cancer is going to be all that happy either. So he has some very practical things to say.
So what have you seen in the past few years about this conversation? Is it a conversation? Is it a battle? What are you seeing?
Well, first things, at least within the communities I travel in, which are not traditional communities, but convert communities and pretty assimilated, Western assimilated communities. Mm-hmm. You don't hear teachers talking about rebirth very much, okay? And you don't hear them talking about achieving any states of perfection too much. What they're talking about is really in line with what I'm talking about. They talk about, well, be mindful or be discerning. You don't want to get rid of desire, but you want to be able to understand when a desire is truly good for you and in your own interest. And you want to approach the desire in the right way, not too fixatedly or obsessively or rigidly. You want to be able to let go when you can, but still pursue it when it's reasonable to. So, most of them teach teachings that are really in line with this idea, that what we're really after is not some kind of perfected state, but really some kind of enhanced well-being. Okay, we want to suffer. We don't want to be perfectly free from suffering. We want to suffer less. We don't really believe that there is this life perfectly free from suffering. So
And
I
how
think
could he be
most,
shown that we're wrong? I would love to see that. But as you had mentioned earlier in this, is like, okay, so if this is inevitable in following the path, with millions of practicing devout Buddhists, where are all the perfectly enlightened people?
exactly. So I think most of the practical teachings that we hear every day in Dharma talks are really in line with this, only they don't admit they're in line with it. They still hold on to the curative fantasy, as Barry Magid calls it, of enlightenment. I think we'd be better off doing without it, though. I think that I see, in a number of practice communities, people are pursuing enlightenment with this kind of dogged intensity that I think is really counterproductive. Zen has always had this wonderful laid-back attitude, or at least some forms of Zen do, that say, just be in the moment. Don't have any gaining idea. Let go of ideas of pursuit of enlightenment and just be here, be present, and just notice what's happening. I'm saying that knowing that there's also this other tradition that says, practice like your hair is on fire.
Yep, yep.
And certainly within some of the Rinzai tradition, there's that tendency of on a sesshin, for example, on an intensive retreat, just trying fiercely to kind of reach some kind of state. But I think a lot of the teaching that I'm hearing is really in line with this. I was looking back at some books I had read maybe 10 or 20 years ago, say a book by Jack Kornfield, something like that, and he doesn't even use the word enlightenment. He talks about spiritual maturity, for example. So I think this tendency to kind of abandon this old idea of enlightenment and establish some more Western idea of well-being and flourishing is deeply ingrained in contemporary Buddhist practice, although it's not openly admitted.
You're right, and I've seen the same thing over the years, is that there are, in some settings, a sharing about the teachings around rebirth, for example, or enlightenment and coming to that place. And in others, and particularly, you're right, the convert Western Buddhist Sanghas tend not to focus on that so much as what are you encountering in daily life, which is kind of a premise of secular Buddhism, is what does this mean to you? And how do you encounter it? So I'm also wondering, in one of the chapters of the book is about Buddhist ethics and eudaimonic enlightenment. And one of the things that I run into on a regular basis is there's a strong adherence to a need to include explicit Buddhist ethics in secular mindfulness programs, for example. And I say, well, which particular ethics are you talking about, from which particular tradition? And before we even get to that point, can you help me understand where the example of this changing the world has been in the past 2,600 years? And what about this endless stream of teachers and monastics in traditional settings behaving badly? We'll just put it that way. So I'm wondering what in your chapter, if you touch upon that at all.
Well, you brought up about 3 or 4 ideas.
Yeah.
So maybe we can separate them out. I mean, there is the idea about social progress and engaged Buddhism, and what does Buddhism have to say about social improvement, if anything, and social movements. And then there's the question about the role of ethics in mindfulness training. And then there's the third question about the role of ethics for teachers in general, in terms of all the enormous number of boundary violations and abuses we've seen from Buddhist teachers in all traditions over the years. So let me start with the historical question first. And that is that when we look at Buddhist social movements today, for example, anti-war movements or anti-poverty movements, or organizations like Buddhist Global Relief that are involved in teaching people how to, teaching girls how to, giving them an education, or teaching farmers how to grow more sustainably, or providing food banks and so forth. In all of them, there's an idea of justice, involves social justice. And you do not find any reference to social justice anywhere in Buddhism. That's not a Buddhist idea. The Buddha didn't believe in the caste system in India, for example. Anyone could become a member of the Buddhist Sangha. On the other hand, he didn't advocate the abolition of the caste system. The Buddha didn't believe in war, and he tells soldiers who meet with him in the ancient Buddhist suttas that if they live the lives they're living, they're going to go to hell because they're taking human life. But when he talked to the kings, He didn't advise them to abolish their armies. Okay? He never changed his personal judgments about what's virtuous or not into the question of a progressive social movement that he encouraged his followers to join in with. So I think when we're looking at engaged Buddhism, we're looking at a Buddhism that is absorbing some of Western lessons, ideas of justice, that are derived from the Greeks and derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition, the prophets, and so forth. And we're grafting them onto Buddhism. And I think that tendency is so universal. It's not just something that we Westerners do. It's something that people in Asia do, because that's become part of Asian culture in the last several hundred years as well, although it wasn't maybe 1,000 years ago. So, I mean, Mao Zedong and Nehru and Thich Nhat Hanh all have an idea of justice that's kind of like our modern idea of justice. That's something that grew out of the anti-slavery movement and out of the suffragette movement and out of the commune movement in the 1840s in Europe and so forth. It's come down as a tradition that's the world tradition. If you want to talk about the ancient Bodhisattva vow to help all other people become enlightened, okay, all beings become enlightened, really was a vow not to improve people's material well-being, but to help everyone reach a state of nirvana. But we've reinterpreted that now. Now we say it's to relieve suffering in everyone around the world. This is a new modern conception of Buddhism. It's not the one that it began with. And I think it's fine, I think it's great, but let's just acknowledge it. So when we begin to talk about Buddhist ethics, not in the context of perfect enlightenment, but in the terms of eudaimonia, and Aristotle's idea that we want to have well-being and we want everyone to have well-being, and we want to structure society in that way, that fits perfectly well with Buddhist practice. Okay, that's part of our goal: help everyone achieve well-being as best we can, and to have justice as part of what we're trying to do, as well as having mindfulness is part of what we do. Okay. When it comes to MBSR and MBCT and all the mindfulness practices and ethics, I've just written an article on this that's going to be in the Humanistic Psychologist later on this summer, looking at it from the eudaimonic enlightenment perspective that I've been talking about. I mean, first, my own experience in an MBSR course, taking it at the Center for Mindfulness, is that I don't know anyone who embodies the virtues that that I hope people will get out of eudaimonic enlightenment, approach, than the teachers I met down in Worcester, Mass. I mean, I think about the way they held the group together in compassion, the way that they it fostered individual development without dogmatically telling them how they ought to be, the way that they help people listen to their own experience and understand it better, the way they had respect for everybody in that room. I mean, they embody ethics in everything they do. The whole group is held within an ethical envelope or context, and people model that. You see the people in the group begin to model it in the way they talk to their fellow members, and then they tell you how they brought it back to their families, how the other day they might have had an argument with their spouse, but they didn't. Instead, they just breathed. They learn it that way. So I think there's this kind of tacit ethics that's built into the MBSR model that people get without having to be explicitly taught.
And I've shared that many times with folks, that McMindfulness folks who push back on, but there isn't this explicit ethics. And okay, which explicit ethics do you mean? And there's never a response for that. Instead, there is, as you're describing, this is implicit. It's how the teacher holds the space, how the teacher models this and elicits that best progress and growing in the participants in the programs.
Right. And then there's this other argument that's this kind of politicized argument that comes mostly from the political left, which is that in teaching, if you teach a mindfulness course in a corporation, for example, that you're teaching people how to just accept the anti-humanistic values of the corporation, that you're becoming a handmaiden to neoliberalism or capitalism or whatever the complaint is. And I have a couple of thoughts about that, which is that first of all, the aim of mindfulness is not to teach politics. It's to teach you how to be more attentive to your own experience in
Out
some
of
way.
scope for what we're doing.
Well, I think ethics is part of what we're teaching people, how to be thoughtful, how to be considerate, how to, you know, how to understand what your own values are. I mean, that's, I think as you're doing mindfulness practice, you get in touch with your own value system. Okay? It's not asking you to detach from it. There's this myth that when we say that mindfulness is, I'm trying to remember what the phrase is usually used, but non-judgmental. Okay? That the idea is we're not supposed to have any opinions at all about what's right and what's wrong.
That discernment goes away along with the non-judgment.
Exactly. Non-judgmental means accept your experience is what it is.
Right.
Don't push it away and say this, oh no, this can't be, you know. Mindfulness means, yes, I do have cancer. Mindfulness means, yes, I do have racist ideas. Mindfulness means, yes, I am not perfect in all kinds of ways. Okay. And accepting that. Okay. But that doesn't mean that you don't have any preferences to be different or to change things around. It just means this is the way it is right now. What a relief it is to acknowledge the way things are. So it could be that I, in my own discernment about things, could come to all different conclusions about what the right thing is to do. Okay, I could believe that it makes a good deal of sense to pull all our troops out of Afghanistan right now, or it makes a good deal of sense to leave some troops there, or it makes all kinds of sense to have a socialist system, or I don't think socialism really works. I think some kind of mixed capitalist economy is really a better. You could have all kinds of opinions. Buddhism has nothing to say about that, and neither does mindfulness. It's saying learn to observe, learn to be with what is, learn to understand it, be in touch with your own inner most important things, okay, where your own inner direction is and so forth, and then act on that when it's appropriate to. But I think to tell people they ought to believe something in particular about how the society ought to be, that's not, mindfulness has nothing to say about that.
Right. And then the objective I continue to hear is, oh, but if we don't do things our particular way with our particular ideological view or agenda, then we're promoting the participants in these programs from simply passively accepting what's here. And that is not how, and I do teach in the corporate world. I've done that for years. That's not how I teach. That's not how anyone I've ever spoken with who does this teaches. And that's a pushback, is like, no, this is about becoming more aware of what the conditions are, whether they're your own internal ones or those around you. And how do we elicit change in that, whatever that happens to be, but we're not going to prescribe, and it has to be this particular thing.
One of my first teachers was Larry Rosenberg. Do you know Larry at all?
Yeah.
Well, Larry had this wonderful thing where he said, if you're sitting in a meditation hall and it's on fire, he says, a really mindful person would not be sitting there going, warm, warmer, 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 hot, very hot. They'd be the first one off their cushion helping everyone out the door. And I think that's what I've been taught all along, you know, that there's wise action that goes along with discernment. It's not a training in passivity. Yeah. And again, I agree with you. I've never met a mindfulness teacher who taught that it was training in passivity.
Well,
last part of that question was about Buddhist teachers who abuse their students, whether sexually or financially or just in terms of power relationships. And let's just first acknowledge this is a major problem in the Buddhist community. It is not something that is unique to teachers who came from Asia. It's just as common in teachers who were born in the West. It's not unique to any tradition, whether it's Vipassana or Vajrayana or Zen, although it may be a little bit better in insight meditation because insight meditation actually has a set of ethics that teachers are expected to abide by that are written down and are taught. And let's just note that it's not unique to Buddhism, that it's true for the Catholic Church, it's true for Jewish rabbis, it's true for clinical psychologists, about 10% of them will abuse their patients. It's true for physicians, it's true for lawyers, it's true for every profession or group you look at, that there are a substantial number of people who abuse people. The problem that Buddhism has that might be unique is that it wants to empower teachers with special privileges in some ways, that teachers are seen as being enlightened, that are seen as being enlightened beings who can do no wrong and have the answers to every question in life for you. and that your life is screwed if you don't follow what they have to say and do what they have to say, because that's the only route to enlightenment. You know? So I think it's that undue deference and respect that we give to teachers that creates an additional problem, an additional power differential that's a license to abuse. And then Buddhism also has the tradition of crazy wisdom in it, especially the Vajrayana tradition, where teachers may do all kinds of things that are against the norms within tradition, and it's seen as a sign of wisdom. And that gives them some kind of credibility that they might not otherwise possess. And then it can also give teachers themselves the illusion that somehow they're on some kind of existential plane above their students, that they've had an attainment of some kind. And that allows them to see things free of sexual desire and greed and avarice and sadism and everything else that human beings are prey to. So I think the idea that there is no such thing as perfect enlightenment or perfect teachers, that we're all more or less muddling through, some of us better, some of us worse, that people have to trust their own experience rather than trust a set of teachings out there. These are all things that I think help maybe protect people from the abuses that might be inherent in the way things are currently arranged. I don't know if that's a kind of a short answer to the question.
It's a big topic, and I think you're right. One of the biggest challenges we face is just the open acknowledgement that this is a very real thing. It's not unique to Buddhism. It's in all aspects of human endeavor. Mm-hmm. And how do we work with that? What are the things that we might do that can help prevent or at least mitigate this kind of thing from happening? And again, not just true for Buddhism, but for all areas of human endeavor.
Well, I think there's a way that we have a responsibility for educating people who are first entering the Buddhist world about what the danger signs are. Right. Okay, what lets you know that you're in a cult, or you're in a cult of personality, for example, and why that might be dangerous for you to do, no matter how alluring or charming the teacher may be. I just finished writing a kind of another book that will be out in May, that is a kind of basic introduction to people who are vaguely interested in Zen, but not really, about how they might take some Zen principles and apply them to their lives and lead better lives, right? And one of the things at the end is I talk about how, if you're interested in pursuing this more, how do you find a Sangha that is the right fit for you? And I talk about shopping around, but I also talk about searching the internet for any kind of signs that there might be any scandal associated with the teacher and so forth. It's really, caveat emptor, buyer beware. You have to educate people how to be good consumers.
And I hope you'll come back and talk with us about that book, because I did notice that's coming out soon too. So one more thing, just on a personal note, mm-hmm. In your explorations for this book, when we're talking about now, what did you find the most interesting as you're doing this research? What stood out to you?
I find it all endlessly fascinating. I have a disturbing tendency to get interested in everything. Let me just, that's a hard question to answer, Ken. You've asked me a rotten question right here. I think the most interesting thing for me in my own practice, I talked earlier about how the instructions in Zen are practiced without any goal in mind, without any gaining idea. And why might that be superior to a kind of practice in which you have a kind of goal in mind? And what I'm aware of is that as we listen to our own experience deeply and just give ourselves permission to just sit with it as it is, that all things have come up for us, all sorts of things come up for us about what our next step is in life. If you think about a life as a kind of a wandering journey to things, that never would have come up if we had thought about them logically. If we said, well, I want to go in this direction and what's my next step there? And the way that cognitive behaviorists often tell us to kind of do things. It's not a linear kind of thing, that all kinds of imagery or thoughts or awarenesses dawn on us that if we hadn't given them space and we hadn't been quiet enough to listen to them, we never would have heard. And there's this amazing process of discovery, of letting that guide your next step forward. It's a whole way of embodied living that is an extraordinary thing to discover and an amazing gift to have. And it's what I hope everyone gets out of the practice, I guess, a clearer understanding that how important that is, this letting life blossom and emerge and show yourself its own direction rather than thinking you're in charge and making specific logical decisions about how things ought to go. You need that logic to check against those intuitions. You don't want to go off half-cocked, but on the other hand, there are all kinds of things you would never discover in life and directions you would never have gone if you hadn't been able to listen to those inner voices as they emerge.
So with this ongoing dialogue, just looking to the future, what are some things you think might be most helpful with that? Are there some course corrections we might make now early in this conversation, or some boundaries that might help?
Well, I think things move. I don't think things can be steered. I think they move and evolve on their own, despite our best efforts, or or because they're our best efforts, despite our worst efforts. So I don't think anyone can steer or evolve any of this, but I think this just becomes part of the conversation, and the more explicit it can be. Let me back up a bit, because this is another very meaningful thing for me. I've gotten this from, I have a friend of mine who's a scholar on the works of Gene Gendlin, and most people know Gendlin from his work in psychotherapy and experiencing. But he actually is a philosopher, and he has a lot of deep things to say about philosophy and about meaning and about language and symbolism and so forth. And he says that when we say something, it's only a very, very tiny part of what we mean or intend to say. If you ask me what democracy is, and I say, well, democracy is governed by the people or something, I could have written 1,000 words about what democracy is. And somebody else could come back and write a 1,000-word tome about why I was wrong. Where everything I said, what got left out, what got half said, what got missaid. And then this conversation goes on endlessly. What is practice? I can tell you what it means for me right now, and you can tell me what it means for you, and we can have this conversation, and it'll evolve as we go on. And none of it will exhaust what there is to say about practice. I know John Kabat-Zinn said this when I took this course, the mindfulness course with him 25 years ago, that after sitting for so long, what sitting meant for him kept changing even then, that it didn't have a fixed final meaning. So I think that's what's happening with Buddhism here. There will be this emerging Buddhist modernism, which I think will be the mainstream within American Buddhism. Some of it will fade off into secular mindfulness, and won't be Buddhism at all, it'll be something else. It'll become part of the culture in general. There'll be reactionary movements against that, and let's get back to the Buddha's real teachings and how awful it is that it's been secularized. And then there'll be a movement against that. And it fascinates me how every movement back to the original Buddhism is really a reinvention of the original Buddhism within a modern context. I mean, this has been true throughout Buddhist history. You go back into, say, the medieval Japan, and when they reinvent Dogen Zen, what they think is Dogen Zen then, it isn't Dogen Zen, it's their new Dogen Zen that fits the medieval period instead of the 1200s, So we're always reinventing it. It's always new and fresh, and there's always something new to say. And isn't it wonderful just to be part of that conversation without thinking that we can steer it in any particular direction?
Thank you so much. And listeners to this episode, again, I'm going to have a link on the episode page to Seth's book, as well as a link to his website. Our guest today, Seth Zuiho Segall. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, what a pleasure it is. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.